We are actually 57 over independent senior living community. So if any of you are 55 and looking for a rental option, we can help you. So we actually have, and I just wanted to put this out to you guys, if you are interested in a tour after, I'm happy to give everybody a tour. We are a truly one-of-a-kind community. We do share a campus with the Bristol, which is assisted living, but this is all independent living. So we offer short-term stays and long-term stays. We have turnkey apartments. We have these 2 beautiful restaurants. This amazing staff here. And we just basically let people live a concierge type life. So you're gonna get a little taste of our cuisine today. And hopefully if it goes well, you'll come back. So I just wanted to welcome you all, and Stephanie, and thank you all for the opportunity to co-host this event. So I hope you enjoy your lunch, and I'm available for any questions after. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome.
This is our the microphone. So you should be okay talking.
Okay. Are you want to give?
Yeah, I'll just.
Yeah.
So again, welcome everyone to our February Lunch and Learn, first in-person Lunch and Learn. Let's have a clap for that. In 2022, it's been 2 years and of us having to do the virtual. So we're very happy that Allison McGovern, Dr. McGovern has offered to come and speak in person. And thank you all for coming out and supporting the Historical Society. I'm very thankful to Encore and also to People's United Bank for always sponsoring the Lunch and Learns, the virtual and in-person Lunch and Learns as well. Let me give you a little bit of background on Dr. McGovern. Anthropological archaeologist in the greater New York area. She's done a lot of work out east on Long Island with a lot of the African-American properties. And her latest property that she worked on was the Crippen House, which is getting a lot of press in Huntington, which is very exciting for us as Huntington residents to really start to promote our Black heritage, African-American heritage in Huntington. We do have a lot of it, and I'm sure that as the Crippen House Foundation gets a little bit more funding, and the museum is started there, we're going to have a lot of rich history. So we're glad that Dr. McGovern is here to talk about this and shed some light on a very current topic. But as we're talking to a lot of friends, Black history is everyday history. It's not just this month. And let's keep that in mind. And I'll turn it over to Dr. McGovern. And thank you all again for attending.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction. Thank you all for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk about archaeology and talk about the Crippen House project with you all. I'm going to figure out how I can share my screen to the home viewer.
It's like you can co-host.
Yep, I think I got it. Okay. I hope so. I hope so anyway. We're good? Okay. All right. So thank you very much for having me today. I'm very excited to be here to talk about active research at Huntington's own Crippen House site. I've known about this site for a long time. And as Robert Hughes, the town historian who's also here today, will attest, it's been a long road to get to this point of documentation and research at the site. So I'll be discussing a bit about the archaeological survey, which was conducted at the site around this time last year, which was celebrated as a kickoff to Black History Month in 2021. And this year, it's exciting to be revisiting that work for Black History Month programming again in Huntington. So before I get into that, I want to tell you a little bit more about who I am and the work that I do. There we go. Okay. So I'm a professional archaeologist with a firm called Richard Grubb and Associates. And as an archaeologist, I provide a unique service in the fields of engineering, environmental permitting, and construction. And that is to determine if new construction may impact buried archaeological sites. So people don't typically think of archaeology as being a part of construction and engineering, and not every construction project has archaeology done at the site. But the work that I do in contract archaeology is regulated by environmental laws at the federal, state, and local level that are designed to review whether or not an archaeological site might be impacted by new building projects. So it's a different kind of archaeology compared to what people typically think about of a professor in an academic institution doing research with students. It's a very different professional environment. Archaeology, especially historical archaeology, provides a method for understanding lived experiences at the micro or place-based level. Historical archaeology relies on multiple lines of evidence, many of which are illustrated here. In addition to, first off, archaeology involves the recovery of artifacts and features at archaeological sites, which is what people typically think of with archaeological research. This involves digging with shovels and trowels, but sometimes we use machine assistance with backhoes at sites. An example of using shovels and trowels is pictured here in the upper left. This is me in the field in East Hampton at the East Hampton Historical Farm Museum site. In addition to the field work, archaeologists refer to historic maps to see if there's evidence of historic buildings or farmsteads. Sometimes those maps will have ownership or occupation associated with the structure, so we can take that information and cross-reference it with federal census data to get a sense of how many people lived at a particular site, what they did for work, and how they were identified by government officials. There's some examples of these documents here. We have a photograph of a historic map from Brookhaven in the lower center of the screen. And then above that is a page from the Brookhaven census. I think it's like 1840, and it's corresponding to that map. For more specific economic information, we can consult account books or diaries that may be available in the special collection sections of local libraries or historical societies. An example of this is on the right, a page from the account books of John Lyon Gardner, which are on file at the East Hampton Library, Long Island collection. And then finally, a very important but often too overlooked resource is interviews and conversations with descendants and local residents. And that's what you see pictured at the lower left with a Mapping Memories of Freetown project that I'm engaged with. Having conversations with various stakeholders provides really important information about the people who lived at the site and what their experiences were. So using these multiple lines of evidence, we can investigate aspects of the past that might not be readily available through other historical accounts, such as economic strategies, labor strategies, and different attributes of ethnicity, race, gender, and class. Now, the bulk of archaeological research that's done in this country is done for compliance purposes, which is the kind of archaeology I mentioned that I do. It's often done as a part of a series of environmental reviews. Not all archaeological sites receive equal attention in terms of research, so that's something to think about. But in general, most professional archaeologists at various levels of education are employed in cultural resources management, as opposed to having academic positions. And this is really important because archaeology for compliance developed as part of infrastructure expanded in the mid to late 20th century. So as roads expanded across the country, archaeology was a very big part of documenting our American past before those infrastructural developments were laid out. And that continues to be the case in energy projects, transportation projects, and development projects. So archaeology is really important for building a record of our country's history. The thing about it, though, is that most archaeological research gets buried in what's called the gray literature, which is compliance reports that get filed with the State Historic Preservation Office or the agencies that are reviewing it to make sure that new development is or isn't impacting archaeological sites. So what I have shown here is the State Historic Preservation Office's Cultural Resources Information System, which is the virtual hub for where these gray literature reports, or these site reports, get archived. It's a method for documenting known and potential archaeological sites throughout New York State, and it's used heavily in infrastructure projects, development, planning, so that people are aware that there's sensitivity in an area before it gets developed. So all of this is regulated by federal, state, and local laws. And in the archaeological process, we do what's called phased work, where we start with a phase 1 survey. If something is detected in the phase 1 survey, then we recommend a phase 2 site assessment, which is to look at more detail in the archaeological resources at a site, and determine if it's eligible for listing on the National Register. The final phase of investigation is phase 3, and not all projects make it to phase 3, but that's in a situation where a site is inevitably going to be destroyed by development. If we can't avoid that site, then we mitigate that site, and it's all carried through guidelines established by New York State archaeologists. So, as I mentioned, so much of this does not get shared with the public. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm working on this larger project called Long Island Dirt, which is supported by the writing fellowship that I got from the Gotham Center for New York City History last year. My main purpose with Long Island Dirt is to highlight some of the research that's generated by contract archaeology on Long Island and share it in this book, which connects history at particular archaeological sites within a more regional approach to understanding Long Island history and identity. And so I'll be able to tie that up a little bit more towards the end of the talk when I'm talking about what we can learn from the Crippen site. So historical archaeology is a unique type of archaeology that deals with what we call the recent past. Historical archaeologists combine archaeological investigation with documentary research, but also living people's memories to produce narratives of past activities and lives. Through historical archaeology, we can examine human experiences as components in the construction of our modern world. So the interesting thing about historical archaeology in particular is that it's often, there's often people who are still living who are connected to the sites. So the history at these sites are not the deep, distant past that we are typically associating with archaeological sites. There's a lot of variety in the way you can investigate archaeological sites, on our timeline. Now, one of the most important contributions of historical archaeology is its ability to give voice to silenced histories. So people of color, poor people, women, mostly ordinary people who lived, worked, and died with no mention of their names in local or national histories. They all left material manifestations of their particular experiences that remain deeply buried in history and the landscape. And what historical archaeologists can do is reveal those vestiges of human activity left behind by silenced or forgotten peoples and interpret their experiences meaningfully. The objects that are found in the grounds are linked to social activity and human cultural experience. And their interpretation is a key aspect of producing a more complete sense of local history. So the multidisciplinary methods of historical archaeology is particularly effective for documenting the histories of marginalized peoples because less emphasis in this process is placed on archival sources, simply because those sources are maybe not the most effective ways for understanding the lives of marginalized peoples. So you have other sources that can be used in consultation with what we can learn through documents. And because you can really begin to understand how people related to other people, to places, and to objects by recovering patterning of material culture at archaeological sites. So one archaeologist has said that what people say they do and what they actually do can be quite contrary. And archaeology provides an avenue for investigating those assumptions that we have about past people's lives. So archaeology is revealing in its capacity to make material connections to place-based narratives. But archaeology also plays an important role in historic preservation, as it means for documenting aspects of the past that are not otherwise visible or that might be impacted by renovation, restoration, or redevelopment at a particular site. And so the Crippen House site certainly falls within these important purposes for archaeological research. And here's a picture of The Crippen House site, I believe I took this last year. So as many of you know, the Crippen site is owned by the town of Huntington. It was purchased within the past few years from the Crippen family, and it was purchased for use as a parking lot for the nearby sewage treatment plant. The house had previously been landmarked by the town for its significance in relation to Huntington's African-American past. And it continues, in the absence of a landmark designation, it continues to be an important site for African-American history. The house and the property were purchased by Peter Crippen in 1864, though some of the research indicates that they may have been living there well before that point, before owning the property in the 1860s. Peter Crippen, let's see, Peter Crippen was one, I don't have any pictures of Peter Crippen, I'm sorry. I know. So Peter Crippen was one of many Southern freed people of color who sought work in New York in the 19th century. Interestingly, his arrival predates the Great Migration by 75 years. And so this is a really important moment in time, not just for Huntington, but for communities of color throughout Long Island. We're starting to see through the research lots of connections to this particular moment in time. So let's see, he was born on Quaker Thomas Crippen's Gargatha Plantation in Accomack County, Virginia in 1809. Questions abound among local historians as to his status as a freed man or a captive prior to 1818, when Thomas Crippen's daughter, Sarah, inherited the plantation from her father and filed a deed of manumission for Peter and his father. Peter Crippen's father died in the late 1820s. Not long after that, Gilbert Crossman, an owner of the Crossman Brickyards in Lloyd Harbor, sent word to Accomack County, Virginia, that workers were sought for his Lloyd Harbor brickworks. Peter Crippen traveled north in response to that call for workers. And so what I have pictured here is actually an 1830s map of Lloyd Neck. Below it, it's labeled West Neck, and on the left side, you could see the brickworks right over here. Okay, and so it's really important to think about these geographic connections, by examining historic maps, the connections between the Crossman Brickyards and the Peter Crippen site. The Crossman account books from 1836 and through 1838 indicate that Crippen earned $12 a month working for Crossman. And I would like to point out that the Crossman account books were researched at the Huntington Historical Society. So the pages in the account book demonstrate economic activities for Peter Crippen and many other people who worked for the Crossmans at the Brickyards. As we can see from the account books, Crippen rarely made purchases against his wages. I think once in 1837, he purchased potatoes and turnips, and once in 1838, he purchased beef. And he occasionally earned additional money by loading a sloop or tending the kiln. So these kinds of documents provide interesting clues to the economic relationships between business owners and their laborers. And so not just exchanges of goods for money, but exchanges of goods for services, which was very common during the period. When Peter Crippen arrived in New York, he made connections with longstanding families and communities of color in Cold Spring Harbor and Huntington, as well as white business owners, farm owners, landowners, and laborers. So archival data provides some clues to his settlement strategies prior to the purchase of the property at Creek Road. And we can trace his movements throughout Huntington neighborhoods through census data, historic maps, and other archival data like school censuses, account books, and newspaper articles. And again, the Huntington Historical Society has been one of the most important resources of information in developing the historical accounts of the site. Peter Crippen and his neighbor at one time, Nelson Smith, were among the 7 founders and trustees of the African Methodist Ebenezer Church, currently the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, I believe, which was founded in Huntington in 1843. Their homes on Creek Road were located approximately half a mile from the church. Shortly after its founding, the church had one of the largest AME congregations in Suffolk County. It played an important role in religious, social, and civic functions for the communities of color in Huntington and Cold Spring Harbor. Peter Crippen died in 1875, but his family, Crippen and Carmen family members, continued to live at the Creek Road site through the 20th century. During their residency there, they witnessed significant changes to the landscape around them. And so what you have here on the screen is I believe this is the 1915-ish map of the Hyde Atlas of the North Shore of Suffolk County, and it's showing the Crippen site, and it's showing disposal works around it. So in 1914, just a couple of years before this map, plans for a town sewer system were underway, and a news article in the Long Islander identified 5 people who spoke out in opposition to the plan at a town meeting. William Crippen spoke out as one of the 4 opposed to the proposed location of the sewage plant on the meadows at the head of the mill pond. And that's what you see on the right is a snippet of that newspaper article that talks about the efforts to build the system and the people who support it and the people who don't support it. Let's see, the article notes that William Crippen, quote, who owns and resides in a little cottage on the meadows within a few feet of the proposed site of the disposal plant, very naturally objected to the location chosen. I think anybody would, right, who's living there. Okay, so archaeology was done here at this site as part of a documentation process, typical, though not required in this instance, of regulatory review when new impacts need to be reviewed. Stakeholders and preservation advocates, including the town historian and the members of the African American Historic Designation Council, encouraged the town to commission the archaeological investigation. These advocates knew that changes to the site would impact the archaeological resources. Now, there are many questions about the site and the house, and it is our hope that the archaeology contributes to our understanding of site use over time. The building, as many of you probably already know, the building is believed to have components of a 17th century grist mill. So there's questions about how old the structure is and when and how it was transformed into a residence over time. And so these are questions, these are going to be long-term questions that may be answered or maybe they won't, but they're part of an interesting narrative for the site. And reviewing changes to the landscape over time is a really important part of this process, which is why I'm showing this image on the left, which is a Huntington Historical Society resource, I believe, right? The 1880 Edward Lang image, and Robert provided a close-up of this these particular buildings, which may represent the Crippen site. So it's important to think about the way the site was organized over time. And certainly it's disheartening to be able to look side by side between this image and the image of the house in its current condition. But I'm not here to speak about the condition of the house, partly because I'm an archaeologist and not an architect or architectural historian. But it is worth noting that descendants of Peter Crippen inhabited this site through the 20th century, before and even as the town developed the sewage treatment plant on 2 sides of their property. Many people would look at the structure and not see it for its historical significance. And I would argue that it is not for us to judge. Based on its current condition, what the site and the historical resources can reveal about 19th and 20th century history for a family of color in Huntington is really what's important here. And its condition is certainly a part of that site's narrative, right? And how it got to this point over time. So let's get into some of the archaeology. The archaeological work was done in January of 2021, and we did what we call phase 1 archaeological survey. Phase 1 archaeological survey is designed to detect the presence or absence of archaeological sites within a property, property. It's a first step in determining if there's archaeological information that might be buried on site. And you might think, well, shouldn't we automatically assume that there's archaeological resources on the property? I think it's always best to assume that there are potential archaeological resources on a property before it gets redeveloped. But this phase 1 survey process is necessary to be able to say definitively yes or no that there's archaeological resources here. And if there are archaeological resources, have they been completely disturbed by what has happened since those deposits were buried? And so that's why we start with phase 1 archaeological survey. Before we do excavation at a site, we review the site's archaeological sensitivity based on environmental features. So we look at the proximity of the site to fresh water or coastal resources. We look at the presence or absence of known structures. And we look at other known or potential archaeological sites that have been documented by other people in the vicinity of the project site. And that's why the Cultural Resources Information System, which I showed you on like around slide 3-ish, is a really important resource for doing and documenting archaeology, because we can refer to that online module and see where, in relation to the Crippen site, other archaeological sites have been identified. And does that make sense for our site? Like, does it mean that we are likely to find similar sites based on what's been found nearby? So in addition to reviewing that Cultural Resources Information System, we look at historic maps to see how the site was documented and changed over time. The earliest map that I found related to the site that shows buildings on it dates to 1838. So this is a lower portion of that same map that shows the Crossings brickyard. As you can see on this map, there's no names or ownership or habitation associated with the structures on this map, but the map clearly shows 1 or 2 structures within the project site. Okay. By the time of the 1873 map shown here, you can clearly see that Peter Crippen is identified as living at the site. And so this is after the date of the deed for which he acquired the property. So we're developing a timeline. Now, 20th century maps reveal how site organization changed over time and how the sewage treatment plant grew around the Crippen site. We refer to 20th century maps also to explore, more recent disturbances that may have occurred at a site. But in the case of the Crippen property, these 20th century maps are also significantly connected to continued descendant occupation of the site. So it's not just about how the site changed over time, it's also about how people continue to live here and make use of the site. Now, with this documentation, what can archaeology tell us about a site that we wouldn't already know? Well, residences often have cultural features associated with structures that provide clues for historic human behavior. So we look for things like trash pits, privy holes, wells and cisterns, or even activity spaces in yards. Okay, and these are all important clues for investigating a site. They all could reveal different types of archaeological materials. So for instance, if we were able to locate a privy hole on the site, after the privy was no longer used, that privy hole would be filled in, and it's often filled in by people's garbage and then capped with dirt. And so if we are able to identify that cultural feature and excavate it, we can learn about the period when the privy was no longer in use. We can look at historic ceramics and talk about when they relative cost at the time that they were made, how long they may have been in use, if it reveals anything about the kinds of meals people were having, if there are examples of food preparation or food service. So there's a lot of potential with the archaeological deposits. Trash deposits are really important for understanding past activity at a site. And people deposited their trash in various ways. They may have used the closed up privy to throw out their garbage. They may have designated a separate hole in the back of a piece of property to deposit their garbage, or they may have thrown it out rear doors and windows. And then it generally gets sort of dispersed across the yard. And these are all examples of the ways that people deposit their trash in the past. There's lots of clues also to how people organize space. And especially, this is especially important with sites of African-American heritage, but we've seen at research at sites, particularly in the American South, where yard space is very important for not only cultivating gardens, but also doing specific activities or organizing in particular areas. And the way yard space is maintained through sweeping has important archaeological signatures. So these are all the kinds of things that we would want to explore at a site of African-American heritage. Let's see, but not all of these would be detectable from the surface, right? We wouldn't be able to see traces of this activity from the surface, so we would have to survey to identify them. And we do typically work within survey guidelines that are established by the New York Archaeological Council for phased archaeological work. So it's all, the work that we do is all regulated to try and make it more objective and scientific for comparison. Let's see, in addition to this methodology, the Crippen site has the benefit of a long history of occupation until the late 20th century. So not only do we have this incredible aerial photo of the site from 1959, so this is a view of the sewage treatment plant, and you can see the house like towards the lower right corner. And I'm just going to give you a zoomed in picture, and it's just an incredible view of the house and the yard space, and then the boundaries of the treatment plant coming right up to the rear yard space. But in addition to these resources, we have the benefit of contact with descendants who grew up in the house. And their memories for site organization are incredibly useful for developing archaeological research at the property. So in January of 2021, the entire site was walked over by myself and Robert Hughes. I'm going to stop calling him town historian because you all know he's here. So we walked across the site with Raymond Kip Carmen, a descendant of the Crippen Smith Carmen family. And Kip grew up at the site, and his memories provided key information in developing a survey testing strategy. So together we walked over the site and reviewed the landscape. He shared memories of how rooms were laid out and their functions within the house. And this is a key resource for us. We walked all across the property, and I was in particular taken by the information that he told at one window, and I think it is not in this picture. Shoot, where is it? Oh, I don't have it in these pictures. There is a window on the side of the house, on that side, okay, which is like the north elevation. And it's this little window, and it seems kind of close to the ground. And he says this was the birthing room. Every one of my ancestors was born in this room until Huntington Hospital was built. And then our family was born in the hospital down the road. And so you don't get stories like that, right? You don't get connections to material lifeways until you actually have a conversation with the person who grew up in the site. And that could have been lost, we could see how the family adapted over time to living here, building on extensions to the property. All of that is really important in understanding the site over time. He also shared memories of previous buildings that he remembers on the property, like an old outhouse that he recalls in a particular part of the property. He remembers gardens and orchard trees, and even an animal pen, which is depicted in the right side of the right photo. The cement blocks represents an area that was used as an animal pen. If you're familiar with the site, it's very small. But he explained a lot of activity that took place in this real small yard space around the house. So we use that to develop a testing strategy at the site. And I just want to point out that the New York Archaeological Council guidelines do not require interviews of descendants in developing testing strategies at sites. And so this was the first time that I sort of introduce this into a compliance-based project where it wasn't already expected. And it was a huge asset, you know, in understanding the site. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do in my practice as I move forward is implement this into the research design more and more, and encourage other professional archaeologists to do the same so that we can ask meaningful questions about the site. So we used this information to lay out 9 shovel test pits at the site. If you look at the aerial photograph on the left, all of the circles represent the 9 shovel test pits that were dug at the site around the house. Shovel test pits are dug with shovels. That's me on the right, digging a shovel test pit. We use shovels to dig holes that are about 1 foot in diameter, and they go to about 2 feet below the ground surface, because we expect by that time that you'll hit sterile soil and you'll be below any cultural deposits. We screen all of the dirt from the shovels using wire screen on site. We save the artifacts. We record soil stratigraphy, and then we fill the holes back in. And we test the site systematically using a grid. Again, there's intervals of testing that are dictated by NIAC standards, and so we work within those standards. These STPs helped us to understand areas of high concentration with artifacts, and we use that information to lay out a larger excavation unit in one particular area. And if you saw any of the news footage from last year, that was when we opened up a larger square unit. And Sarah Kautz was in the field with me. She's from Preservation, Long Island. She's also a professional archaeologist, and we worked together in investigation of the site, which was really fun to do. So we opened this 1 by 1 meter unit to get a closer look at the kinds of artifacts that were coming out and the kinds of soils that the artifacts were coming out of. And what we found was traces of what's called a historic midden. So you all sort of chuckled about people throwing trash outside their windows and doors, you know, and then it gets dispersed. Well, that's exactly what this looks like. You know, it looks like some small piece fragments of ceramics and other discarded items that were deposited on a portion of the property and maybe smoothed out. You know, at that time, it probably was the ground surface. And then soil deposition processes happen afterwards, you know, like storms, erosion, things like that. And those deposits get buried. That's how they get buried over time. So while we excavate a site, we're interested in trying to tease out those different soil levels. And so that's what you see on the right, is an illustration of the various levels of soils that we detected in that one unit. And what it means is that it's an area that we need to come back to and take a closer look at, because there's a lot more potential in learning about human Crippen family activity at the site in this particular location. Let's see, what else do we have? Okay, so a total of 513 artifacts was recovered from intact historic era soil deposits. Within the square excavation unit, we saw evidence of what we call a possible sheet midden or refuse deposit. Midden is just a fancy word for garbage. The artifacts recovered from within this deposit demonstrate a diverse collection of historic 19th century ceramics, some of which are pictured in the top of in the top photo. Let me see. And in addition, there were pieces of glass, metal, coal, slag, fragments of bone and shell, which are really important for helping us sort out diet at a particular site. All of this together provides clues to the daily patterns of lived experience at the site. So I took some photographs of some of the more interesting artifacts that came out. I think that the diversity of the ceramics at the site is particularly interesting. So you can see that there's a lot of different pieces with different kinds of decoration, all very small like fragments. And their manufacture dates span from the late 18th into the 20th century. So really talking about the long-term use of the site. On the lower left, you have examples of 2 types of buttons that were recovered at the site. You know, buttons end up in the archaeological records simply because people lose them. You know, they fall off of clothes, or maybe they're not used anymore and they're discarded. That's not really often the case in the 19th century. I think it's more likely that they fell off, and that's how they entered into the archaeological record. And on the right, lower right, are two pieces of porcelain children's toys, which is really important for understanding family life and activities at a site. So there's a piece of a porcelain tea set, children's porcelain tea set, and on the right is a fragment of a porcelain doll from the site. So one unexpected find was in a shovel test pit in the sort of less developed portion of the property south of the house, where I'm actually digging here. I think it might have been found in this pit. Was one quartz biface, which is what you see pictured on the right. It's a pre-contact Native American tool made out of quartz. And by biface, it simply means that it's a piece of stone that was worked on two sides. So it would have been a tool made and used by Native Americans prior to European arrival at, in the lands that would become the Americas. Is it unexpected to find something like this at a site in Huntington? Absolutely not. We're in close proximity to fresh water. But it's interesting that it is found at a site of African American heritage. And so it raises some important questions about site use over time. Let's see. So the results of the phase 1 survey indicate that the site does indeed retain archaeological traces associated with the Crippen family. Those ceramics are squarely dated to Crippen occupation of the site, and that's really important. Additional testing is recommended for uncovering that midden, taking a closer look at it, maybe identifying some other archaeological features. We looked for the privy hole for the outhouse that Kip remembered on site. We didn't find it during the survey, but more intensive investigation through units may be more fruitful at the site. So additional investigations are recommended outside the house to investigate those particular areas. And it's also recommended that a qualified archaeologist be present to monitor the removal of the house, to investigate and identify potential buried archaeological deposits within the footprint of the house. I don't believe, well, the house is built on land that's sinking. I don't believe there's a basement, right? But similar contexts in other parts of Long Island are very revealing underneath the floor of a house. And so we would want to be the opportunity to be able to take a look at those deposits. Just in short, there's a lot more that we can learn from this site. Continuing consultation and oral history research with the descendants would be really important for developing the genealogical history at the site and developing more information about site use, and just in general to develop a more detailed context for the Crippen property. And I believe it's all of our hope that the research from this site will be incorporated into the museum plans for the future. So there's a lot that I wanted to tell you, a short amount of time, but I wanted to sort of break it down to 3 main points about the archaeology at the Crippen House, things that I'm in particular interested in exploring. And I think that the site will make important contributions to these themes as we move forward. The first is the importance of the descendant community in historic and archaeological research. Outreach with descendant communities is just so important. I think that most researchers don't realize how important this is. It's really the only way to make history more inclusive by broadening our methods, asking living people questions, and incorporating their questions into the research process. So I first experienced this, let me see what I have here. I first experienced this in my research with living descendant Native American and African American communities in East Hampton at a site called, in relationship to the site called the Fowler House pictured on the left. So there's a lot of similarities between these two sites. In East Hampton, we developed an ongoing oral history project called Mapping Memories of Freetown that develops research questions. It engages the community in developing narratives and histories of the site. And it's a really important model for doing work as we move forward. In both of these cases, the Fowler House and the Crippen Site, archaeological research is entangled with ethnographic research or interviews of living people. But also in both of these locations, archaeology is entangled with policy with regard to historic preservation. Both cases, archaeology is highlighted as a means for collecting information about residents of a site whose experiences have, until fairly recently, not been considered historically significant in relation to dominant historical narratives. At both of these sites, the house in itself is an artifact, and we can explore how a family lives at a site and modifies that site over time to accommodate changes in their family structure. Okay, and both of these houses have additions that were built on, and maybe supported larger extended families over time. And both of these sites represent the importance of hanging on to a property by a family for a long period of time. The Crippen Site, like I said, was inhabited until the late 20th century. The Fowler House, which was a Montaukett home in East Hampton, still lived in 1980. So there's a lot of parallels that can be seen between these two sites. Okay, second main point I'd like to bring up is the importance of land ownership for people of color and the importance of home space. What does the time of Crippen's purchase, 1864, say about land ownership in the 19th century for people of color? It raises a whole series of questions. How is land ownership even rendered possible among communities of color in the 19th century? We can look at documents like tax documents, which is what I've done for East Hampton, to see when the earliest people of color were recorded and taxed as landowners. And what does that mean for the status of those particular individuals in those communities? How do people of color obtain land? And how was it registered as permanent? That's another thing. You have instances of people of color owning a house, but not the land on which it sits. Or you have instances of documentation between a white landowner that says that the person of color owns the property, but that deed's never registered with the county clerk. And so that has long-term ramifications for how a family can retain ownership of that property over time. What I think is really interesting about the Crippen Site is that it's the Crippen family, I believe, is documented living here before the deed reflects their permanent ownership of the property, which is 1864. And I found a strong similarity with the property that I'm researching in Manorville, 1865. The property is purchased by a family of color, but they had been living there for at least a decade before. And what does this say about this particular time period? Between 1840 and 1870, there was a great deal of discussion about the relationship between property ownership and voters' rights. And particularly in the 1840s, there were efforts to repeal a requirement that African Americans own property to be eligible to vote in elections. So what's happening during these particular decades, and does that contribute to a greater documentation for property ownership in the 1860s? Okay, and the last point that I want to make is the importance of geographies of race and racism and environmental justice. Okay, the fact that the sewage treatment plant was built around a house that had been living there for 100 years, why that location? This is not unusual for communities of color. Long Island has and continues to be highly segregated. There's plenty of examples, other examples of this happening for longstanding 19th century communities of color. where that particular area is decided that it's no longer valuable, and that's where we're going to put disposal facilities. And so a similar example is seen in Cutchogue. Again, with a community of color that was formed primarily by people traveling from the South before the 1860s, establishing a community around a church. And then the town decides to develop waste disposal around that particular property. So these are things that we can continue to explore at the Crippen site and in relation to other sites. I think what it means is that the Crippen site by itself is absolutely important for us to understand the local context of a family of color living in Huntington, but it's also incredibly important to understand how that site relates to other sites that are experiencing similar situations across the Long Island landscape. And so I'd really like to see what those connections can be, and that's what I'm exploring in my Long Island Dirt book. So, so that's the end of my presentation. And thank you.